I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. Happy that you are all back. So I'm really happy to mention that we actually have a full hour of feedback. So you're not going to have any slides from me or anyone else up here for the next hour or so. We're going to continue the conversations and comments that you have. And I believe we left it off over here on the left-hand side. And so what we're going to do, or over here, okay. So, and then we're going to just keep going around and around until we exhaust all the comments, et cetera, and questions that you have. So I believe we have till 2:30, right? Okay, so now we're back officially. So Rita, you have your name placard up, or Sally? Sally, you go first.
So I just want to sort of reiterate things that I've already said, in particular something Helen said earlier about the idea of making it be as inclusive as possible.
Okay.
And I think especially now, if you're doing the research, right, for this research phase, you want to include some of these national identities. It's like if you exclude them now, we'll never know. But if you include them now, we'll have a better chance of knowing. And I do understand that there's an education factor involved, especially with some of the African communities. So it might be that you get a certain kind of response this first time around, or to the whole MENA category, right?
Right.
So I'm hoping that this survey that you're doing now is you understand that it's one moment in time, and that
Right.
it might be that we need to do it again, right? But anyway, I just want to reiterate how I think the more inclusive your category is now, the better data
Right.
you'll have in the future.
One of the things we plan to do is when the results come in, the data comes in, is that we're going to look at different classifications, the size and things like that. That's part of the research as well, right? How people identify it, but also looking at the classifications of you recommending, the experts, right? And so, and other stakeholders that we're engaging with, so that'll be part of it as well.
So, and I also, like several people before, I have a real problem with the word Bedouin being on the list. So Bedouin is not necessarily an ethnic identification, it is a category. So you were saying, in the old days, you used to have the word falah, peasant.
Yeah.
Bedouin is a counter to either you're falahi or you're Bedawi or you're Mudani. Those are like the
Okay.
three categories. You're a city person, you're a farmer, or you're a Bedouin in the Middle East region, right? So it's not the same as these other terms. So
Thank you for your feedback.
the
So
region.
we'll definitely re-examine and look at that term again.
And then I have a question about your oversample. So how are you going to find so you're saying you're doing 1.2 million people plus an oversample of the MENA community.
Right.
So how large will that oversample be? How are you going to find people? And then I think I'm like so happy to hear that you're doing this, and it is a very large number, 1.2 million people, however
Right.
you're oversampling people. But I'm also concerned that you have so many different kinds of questions that you're researching, and I'm worried that will really water down the response.
Right, so what we're gonna do, we don't have our statistician or survey statistician experts here, sampling experts here. This is Pop Division, and of course, we work a lot with the subject matter. We do work with another division that is in charge with the selection of the sample, if you will. But I can talk at a very high level to tell you that very much like our previous census content test that we have done leading up to a census, right? That's how our content is really determined, is by these content tests that we do throughout the decade. And so we traditionally have oversampled for, race groups like Black, Asian, et cetera. And one of the things we want to emphasize is that for the first time in this content test, we're going to be oversampling for this particular population, the Middle Eastern North African population. And we're using data from the ancestry question, which is really the only source of data we have at the national level to identify this population. So we don't know the size of that sample, except for how many housing units we're targeting, which is the 1.2 million. And I do assure that is a representative sample of the whole country. I don't think we have anyone here that could speak to any more of that particular, but we can get back to you on any more specifics on the sample selection and et cetera.
But you're not doing 1.2 MENA people. You're doing
No, 1.2
yeah.
million housing
Yeah,
units
yeah, that's what I
total.
thought. Yeah, yeah.
It's
Okay.
similar to what Roberto said earlier, that we have a large nationally representative sample. The key is that we're going to be able to have strata for key population groups.
Yeah.
So we'll be able to devote part of the sample to a MENA oversample,
Okay.
or to a Black oversample, or Hispanic oversample. We did this successfully in the 2010 AQE, where we had, for the first time, different strata for different populations where we're looking for areas that have larger proportions of those groups to ensure that we can get them into the sample.
And that they're representative in the,
Right.
in the sample.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you're doing that straight up, you would likely miss that population, for example. Okay? All right, excellent question. Okay, so Rita,
Well, Joe has.
okay.
Just I'm wondering, I want to revisit the issue of classification. Is there an intention by the Census Bureau to revisit the criteria for classifications, for the classification of ethnicities?
So, sorry, repeat your question, I'm sorry.
Is there an intention by the U.S. Census Bureau to reclassify the ethnicities here based on what we just read here, or is that an intention?
Well, you're specifically talking about the Middle Eastern, North
Right,
African
right,
category?
MENA,
Right, so
the MENA
we're,
category.
so right now, we have, as I mentioned, we have a working classification that we're proposing, right?
Okay.
And so, of course, this is why we invited you here to give us feedback on that classification. And I've been hearing a lot of great things here, you know, mostly okay, but there are some issues, right? And so we want those feedback forms that say what other groups should be added. So yes, we're
What
examining
about-
that classification.
Yeah, but what about the classification is already in place? If I remember very well, in 1984 and beyond, we visited the Census Bureau with a group of scholars, academians, and on this issue, and we discussed that, especially on issues related to the Chaldeans, Assyrian, Syriac people, and we managed to convince the Census Bureau that this particular group, ethnicity, has to be,
Right.
classified. So why are we reinventing the wheel?
Well, that's a good question. Well, one thing is that it was mentioned in the 1997 standards, as Nicholas mentioned earlier, and we did have a number of experts come and testify and say, hey, this is what it should be. But at that time, there was no recommendations made from ONB. Okay, so we did not have an Arab or a MENA category coming out of the ONB standards, and we still don't have one right now as we speak, as far as a MENA category. So we're revisiting, we're certainly looking at those classifications, but this is why we're present day now, because now we're testing it. We didn't test it before, right? And so that's why we're asking for the classifications for the feedback now.
Right.
I'm not aware of any MENA classification in 1984.
Well, not that. I'm just talking about something you mentioned earlier before we broke off our lunch, and that is, you mentioned that, the groups like Copts and Christians, Chaldeans can be maybe as a Christian category or a religious category, and that isn't the case that we proved to the U.S. Census, and there is a legal case based on that with the U.S. Census back in 1990, so we don't want to change that. That's
Right. Are you specifically talking about the Assyrian Chaldean
Yes,
lawsuit?
and
Yeah,
as
we're
a matter of
familiar
fact,
with
there's a
that.
category
Right.
assigned for this particular group.
Right.
Category
In the ancestry,
number
right.
482 for ancestry issues.
Right. So in regards to that lawsuit, what we know, we have individual codes for Assyrian and Chaldean, and we plan to have that.
Right.
In fact, in your binder, you'll see that we have proposed classification individual codes for that. And in Medadi's presentation, we're going to show you some potential data products that are going to be showing you these specific origins, if you will, not just the pan terms,
Right.
but all these different origins. So yes, so I want to assure everyone here that we have not decided what the classification is
I
going to be.
understand.
So we're going to continue those conversations, and we certainly don't want to undo what's been said to us in the past, for sure. We're definitely going to consider all that information as we move forward. Okay?
Just to add to the participants here, Chaldeans, they were not Christians for 4,000 years until the advent of Christianity took over. Chaldeans are the descendants of the Chaldean Empire from southern Iraq, and that's the very first civilization started in the world was in Iraq, in southern Iraq. And Chaldeans, they come from Ur of the Chaldea. That is the place where Prophet Abraham was born.
Well, I am glad to mention that we are planning to have an individual code for Chaldean. Someone writes in Chaldean, we're going to capture it. and We're going to code it. So-
Syriac. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Rita.
Just some clarification. Can we go to the map slide, please? Sorry. Thank you.
You mean the reference map?
The reference map. And being on both sides, I realized that the task at hand here is to define and identify the Middle East and North Africa, and who's included and who's not included. And I think the census, it's not fair to ask the Census Bureau to draw the line and say, where do you want the Middle East and North Africa to end? Where would you draw the line in Africa? Where would you draw the line in Asia or in Europe for that matter? And this is why we are here to tell them where these lines can be drawn based on our expertise of the region. One thing that I see that has been brought up time and again in this meeting is that the basic national definitions or boundaries are part of the puzzle, but the puzzle is much bigger and includes histories and includes identities and grievances, not just grievances in North Africa, but also grievances here in the United States. And the Armenian case is a great example where the grievances even exist in the United States. Again, the American experience, I want to bring that back to that. So with that in challenge, I think Helen's point is let's be as inclusive as we want, as we can, and the alternative is nothing. If you don't want to be included in this MENA category, then you don't have an alternative way to get data on your constituency or your population. You can get it from ancestry data, and the census folks can talk more about that, but not this 100% count. And can you talk a little bit?
Well, there is some other race,
Yeah.
right?
So
So there is always, we plan to have that category there, and we're not planning to remove it, and so you can definitely, and so remember, one thing I do want to mention is that, remember, folks, is that because of the new strategies coming out of the AQE, that study that we did 5 years ago, the design style question, one of the things we're doing is that we're providing write-in lines for the first time for groups that didn't have it before, under the white and black categories. And people can write in their nationality or ethnicity groups there, and we plan to capture all that. We plan to capture it, code it, and tabulate it. Okay, in this environment now where we're testing multiple race categories, ethnicity categories, okay, so just keep that in mind too. They don't just have to write it in the MENA category. They can write it in the white, in the black, or in some other race. So I think that's also really important because, you know, at the end of the day, there's no really right or wrong, right? It's about self-identities, how people feel about the categories that are there. We do know one thing right now, there's a lot of Americans that are not very happy with the categories there. They're not seeing themselves in the current categories. They're not answering the questions. They're struggling with the categories. This particular Middle Eastern North African category has come out of the grassroots work over the last 30 years, as I mentioned before, saying we don't see ourselves here, we want a category. By the way, and not just this group, we have many other groups, for example, the Caribbean folks, we have the Brazilians as well, we have other groups that also want to come to the table to find themselves. We believe this type of questionnaire strategies that we have now in testing seems to be working well, and that's why we continue testing it. Not only the combined, but as well as the separate as well. We're continuing to test these strategies. Okay. All right. So I believe we're going to go over here, Khalid.
Of inclusion, in the ethnicity section, you should include Nubian, Egyptian Nubian and Sudanese Nubian as two distinct ethnicities. And just a general comment I'll make is that I think it might be useful to envision adoption of a classification as a springboard versus a permanent kind of gesture, right? I think if you can craft and adopt a classification, you can polish over time, you can tweak over time, you can perfect over time, make it more representative, make it more inclusive, and make it more reflective of a demographic that's always going to change. Classifications are flawed, classifications are fluid, largely in part because demographics and populations are fluid themselves. So they're going to evolve, they're going to change in line, ideally speaking, with the changing nature of the demographic itself.
My goodness, I swear I could be here till midnight. That was so let me tell you what, he's absolutely right, and let me tell you why he is. So let me give you an example. So for example, like the Hispanic category, which we introduced actually after 1970. In the 1980 census, that was the first time we used the term Hispanic, right? We didn't have the term Latino until in Census 2000. And why? Because we're having many Hispanics not identifying with Hispanic. They didn't like that term. And so, but they were identifying with Latinos. So this is a great example that over time, right, there's changes that could be made depending how the public responds and how they're, whether they're saying. So he's right, it's not permanent right now. Maybe this may look like this now in 2020, but after 2020, there may be other categories or other examples on there. So do keep that in mind. It does change. It's a relationship we have with the American public. It's not just us dictating what it should be or not be, right? Okay, next. There's so many over there, I don't know who to pick. Sammer. Okay.
If it's okay, I'd like to ask a question about the test itself.
Sure.
And the sampling. Just a concern I have, and you guys probably have the answer to it, is how will you guys make sure that you kind of sample a good cross-section of the Iranian American community, for example? So the feedback you get represents the entire community and not one particular segment of the community.
Right. So my understanding.
And my
Oh,
follow-up
sure, go
question to
ahead,
that is,
absolutely.
what role would community organizations, will there be a role for community organizations in helping the census with doing a sampling of the broader community and promoting the test as well?
Well, let me start out with your second question. That is happening right now, right? We're already meeting with you, many of your community leaders, experts in the area, so we're hoping to get back the message back. We are actually, this national content test is one of many tests that we've been doing, that we've done already, that the Census Bureau promotes. We were just, for example, this past spring, we were in Savannah, Georgia, and I believe, what was the other, in Arizona? Maricopa, where, you know, we're testing strategies, contact strategies about how we're going to enumerate the population, right? And so we also have several other tests coming up in 16 and 17 that we'll talk about in a minute. So this is, so yes, we advertise the testing that we have. We contact experts. We have a national advisory committee that meets twice a year. That is also representatives of the communities that we're targeting, for example, and they go back and tell them about the things that we're doing. And so we have a long-standing stakeholder engagement, and so we don't do everything in a vacuum. We just don't do tests or do anything without informing all the communities, of course the governments, and Congress is about all the testing that we're doing. So that's one part aspect of it. Now, in regards to your first question, the more technical question is that, well, just like we've done with everything else, is oversampling for targeted groups, you know, we go after where they're at. And so in the case of Iranian, for example, we go and target, you know, we look at the ancestry data, where are they concentrated at, and we sure they'll oversample in those targeted areas, in those states, in those counties, et cetera. So that's where, that's the plan, and the plan for all the major MENA categories that we're targeting to do. Now, one of the things you do keep in mind is that some of these populations are very small. And so, you know, there are some population size concerns, you know, they may not get representative samples of all these groups, but I believe that it's the intention is to target where all they're located demographically in the country. We've never done this before for this particular population. And so we're gonna, you know, we don't unfortunately have these experts here with us. I'll be more than happy to follow up with you with these more technical questions and explain to you exactly what the methodology is of how that's gonna be, how that's gonna be implemented, okay? But I do assure you, like many of our race and ethnicity content tests that we have done in the past, we have taken very careful consideration of these populations, of targeting these populations to make sure that they're represented in our sample, so we can make inferences about the population. Okay. Unlike your sample over there, right? You said that your study was basically based on self-report, which is very valuable, by the way, because you know normally you start out that way and then you come up with a national representative sample to do that. But we assure you that this test that we're doing here is an opportunity for, you know, for targeting this population throughout the country. It's not just going to be in Michigan, okay? All right, Sammer?
Yeah, I just want to make a couple comments, one general and one more specific as to the category. My understanding is that we're here to come up with a way to more accurately count the people, or come up with a statistical way of counting the people from the area, or coming up with accurate numbers for us. I don't think we're necessarily here to bring up political complications or political situations or political problems that we're having over there, and then to use that as a basis to how we're going to divide it up. Because if we're going to sit here and start saying, well, we're going to divide up categories pursuant to political complications or political disputes, in this region, you're going to have about 30 or 40 different classifications in that case, okay? I think it's important that we use a catch-all, that we use a category that everybody can feel inclusive and add their name to it. Because as you said, they don't necessarily have to mark it. If, for whatever reason that they don't want to mark Middle Eastern, they can just mark other, they can mark white, and they can
That's
put
right.
whatever they want. And it's also my understanding that all the codes, those statistics are going to be available, correct? So if I mark
Yeah.
down Lebanese, at the end of the day, after the census is done, I'll know how many Lebanese are in here. or how many.
That's the plan.
So each one of us will know exactly who's in these various categories.
Actually, even something better, because after the census, we release a public file that you can create your own categories if you like.
Okay.
After the data's done. or
So,
PUNS.
so in regards to the specifics of what should be included or not included, these countries, I'm talking about the Arab League countries, have sort of chosen to tie themselves together. They've said, we have several things in common, we're going to work as a bloc. To then cut away some of those, for whatever reason you have, and just say, well, you're not going to be included with the rest of them, I think is a little problematic. I mean, the Arab League has said, these 22 countries are all associated with one another. We have a lot in common, we act as a political bloc. So for us then, the census for them to kind of carve out people, I don't think is appropriate. It gives another way for the West to define the region. So that's I think is problematic. So my suggestion would be to go to the 22, the Arab League nations plus. Regarding specifically some of the ones that are not included, and I'll go back to the ethnicity section. I think you should definitely include the Armenians and the Circassians. There are very large populations of Armenians and Circassians in the Middle East, and the ones that are here will identify them, especially the Circassians community in New Jersey, for example. They are Circassian Syrian. A lot of the Armenians will say we are Syrian Armenians. Okay, so these people are living in the region because of various ethnic cleansing programs that occurred in various countries. So they came to the Middle East. The people in the Middle East protected them, housed them, sheltered them, and they've sort of now identified themselves as also being of them. It's sort of like what Americans here. The Italian Americans, Greek Americans, you have Circassian Syrians, you'll have Armenian Syrians. So a lot of them will also identify themselves here. So I would also include those as well.
Thank you for your feedback. Now be sure to fill out your form. Okay. Eric, way back there, I believe. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody over here. Okay.
I have a few comments and questions. First, I wanted to go back to the question about Armenians being part of this group. Running some numbers from the ancestry data on the ACS, it's a pretty large group. A little bit smaller than Lebanese, but on par with Iranians, about the same. But as has been mentioned already, a large portion of the US-born Armenian population is from the Middle East. And then also looking at country of birth or place of birth for people who mark Armenian as their ancestry first or second in the ACS, about 90%, if you include the US there, are from the Middle East. So it is important, even though many of them are not actually coming from Armenia or from Russia, but actually from Middle Eastern countries. So it may be important to include them and use it as an ethnicity and not necessarily a national origin. Let's see. Oh, I also wanted to say, I think it's important to include as many of these smaller ethnicities or different ethnicities that are being listed as codes and as separate codes, because with the 100% data from the census, it may be the only chance to really pick up meaningful data from some of these groups, especially if they're smaller groups, that you may not see them in the ACS. So as a data user, I think it's very good to have those in the 100% sample that you might not see in a meaningful way in the ACS.
Okay. Well, But we have a lot of experience at developing codes, you know. You think there's a lot of codes what you're seeing now? Have you seen the American Indian Alaska Native code list? There's over 1,000 codes there. So yes, to answer your question, yes, we understand. We have codes. There could be thousands of different racial ethnic groups from the Middle East. And absolutely there are, actually, right? Which is why we're focusing in the U.S. Okay, so thank you for your comments, Eric. Cannot see who back there, Stephen? Oh, yeah, the mic.
You can have this.
Well, like many other people, I support the idea of including the sub-ethnicities, and you briefly spoke about that because the Establishment Clause, you can't ask religion, but I think religion is very, very important for a lot of the smaller groups. People have a strong identity with that, and in many cases, I think some of the groups, even though there's a mixing of ethnicity and religion, so even though it might sound like a religious term, it really implies an ethnicity or region or something like that beyond the nation state. Also, there's the idea that these definitions vary across localities. So what's seen as a religion in the U.S. might be seen as a nationality in another part of the world or under another nation state context. And finally, it's almost, I mean, this whole process has to do with identifying categories in the language that works appropriately for that. And it's especially vexing because some of the accepted national or ethnic groups are in fact religious categories, you know, like Chaldean or Assyrian or something. That's accepted as an ethnic group even though you know the religion. Other religious categories aren't able to be used. So given we have this opportunity, can you speak a little bit more about how that decision is made and which terms are seen as specifically religious and which aren't, and how that would be applied? Because I think there are a number of people that identify fundamentally on a religious basis.
Well, I could tell you right now, our current policy right now at the Census Bureau is that we don't collect religion, okay? So if someone says a religious faith, for example, we don't code it. Now, if they say something like I'm Syrian this, then we collect the ethnicity or nationality part. So that's what we do in the ACS, and that's what we traditionally have done in the census, okay? Now, going into developing the Middle Eastern North African category, I could tell you, unlike most other groups, this one has more ethnic religious categories, if you will, as you just mentioned, like the Chaldeans, the Syrians, where the ethnicity and the religion goes hand in hand, right? Well, this is the feedback we need from you, because we're not those experts here. Hopefully many of you here are here because you have expertise in that, and so I need that feedback from you to say, well, can you go back to the ethnicity? I need to hear from you. Well, you have a religious group there, and you shouldn't have that. Or, in your case, perhaps if I'm not misunderstanding you, you're saying, well, you need to have those there. So we need that kind of feedback in there.
Following up from that, you said you collected the data. If it included like a nationality and a religious category, would it be possible to put in categories like that to mark off, so then it would encourage people to check things that would be counted or acceptable?
You mean like a religious example?
Well, a nationality / religious. He mentioned that those would be counted if they weren't just religious, but in
right,
a certain nationality plus.
Right, if they give us a nationality or an origin, or we can clearly code, then we do. Right, we just then not code the specific religious term.
But to kind of encourage or make a pathway for people to respond that way, could you put in some of those categories ahead of time?
As an example, you mean, right?
Oh, okay, you could put in.
Give me an example. Give me an example. Give me a specific example.
Lebanese Catholic, for example.
That, in other words, you would recommend that we put that on the.
Well, if it would be permissible.
No. No, not the current way right now, unless. Use the mic. So, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that we're going back and looking at our code list, right? And so we've looked at our ancestry code list, we looked at our race code list, and we're finding codes that we have for certain groups. And, we have this ethno-religious kind of, we have codes for some groups and some for others. And this is part of the process that we're doing right now. We've been consulting with experts to, revise the code list, to improve the code list. And so these are some of the issues that we're dealing with right now, to be quite frank with you, about who should be in and out. And that's kind of the expertise that we need the feedback on. Because in fact, when Rita joined the Bureau years ago, and we met with some of the other, unfortunately, Akram couldn't be here. He's one of our experts too that reviewed the code list. He had mentioned that, hey, you have some groups in here that you need to remove or add, et cetera. So I want to assure you that this is a process that we've been doing for years. But as right now, the policy is that we don't have any explicit examples of any religion collection or examples on the form.
Just add to this that 1940 was the last census where religion was collected. And today, if you say you're Sunni or Shia, this will not be coded as Middle Eastern, will be given uncodable. But there are ethno-sectarian groups, and this is a term, the linguistic term that is used in the scholarly community, that these are ethnic group that took on a religion that maintained it even after the Islamic expansion into the region, and like the Assyrians, like the Coptic community and others. And so that's the approach.
So, it's a difficult topic, and I knew that, that there's overlap on some of this stuff, and that we have to go there. We have to talk about these issues, and that's why we have this expert forum. And by the way, I think I mentioned this earlier, there's 9 other experts that are consulting with us that couldn't be here, unfortunately. I believe they're on the list, and they're also giving us feedback as well. So just to let everybody know. Okay, so let me go back. I'm going to make my way over here. So I'm going to go back to Farid.
Okay. First, I wanted to say that thanks to Khalid for mentioning Nubians. We certainly believe we should be on that list, right? So that's part of my feedback in the forum. Nubians are an identified ethnic community across Sudan and Egypt. So going back to your questions, the nationalities and ethnicities. Clearly, we want Sudanese to be added to that list. We believe there. But having said that, we understand that we don't live in a perfect world. I think somebody already said that. And so the split of Sudan has created 2 different groups. And so now we already know that South Sudanese, for instance, will not identify with the MENA category, but that's okay. It's better for us to count and be inclusive of Northern Sudanese, and we will educate our community to check the other category for African and African Americans and specify South Sudanese. But there are some that would also self-identify as Sudanese. So just we want to try to be, the message is to be as inclusive as possible, right? And so I support having the MENA category and having Sudanese as a category added to that list.
Thank you very much for your comments. Glad that you're here with us. Dr. Cohen? Oh, the mic.
Regarding the working classification of countries, Turkey seems to be missing, and anytime I speak about the Middle East, I've never seen Turkey removed from the Middle East. So, but again, I'm not an expert in Turkey. It's just every place they talk about Turkey. I wonder how they were not mentioned by many groups. Perhaps because they're trying to get into the European Union or something. I don't know. But this is. I mean, they should be there. As for the.
When I'm actually happy that you mentioned that. Actually, now that everyone's here, do me a favor and send it to me. If there's other organizations out there that have a MENA classification, send it to us. Send it to me, because you're going to find, I'm just saying that this is part of the research, and we're continuing the research, and we're finding more, we can look at.
There are Title IX research centers across the country that have Middle East in their title at universities across the country. And there's not a one that wouldn't include Turkey for sure, but you should look at their definition of
Okay.
the MENA region because it's broader than here.
And
But
we have.
You had University of California was the only one on there, but if you looked at all the other ones, you would see that they're,
And they had a classification?
yeah, yeah.
And they do include
That
Turkey
just
or
seems to
not?
counter,
They
that
do.
seems to
They do,
counter.
they
Of course.
absolutely do.
That
They
seems to
absolutely
counter
do.
our research. We've contacted the
so-
universities, we talked to them, and they're like, I don't know what the definition
Well,
is.
I'll
So, but
give you
that's
the
okay,
Columbia.
but that's okay, that's why we're continuing to do the research and the outreach, right? It's not, we're gonna continue to do this.
If you have those definitions, those are important to send to us. Again, not just the category, but the definition that
Right, the
says
definition, that,
this is
so I
what's
think, I
included.
just wanna make sure, I'm not splitting hairs here. It's like who's in and who's out. That's
Right.
what I want. A list of those nationalities or countries that they define as North Africa
Right.
or Middle East. That's what I want. What we've been finding, that that's not clear or is not defined. That's what we're finding ourselves.
Would you like us to help, would you like us to encourage people to send you a definition
Absolutely.
through
Oh,
through our
well,
local?
we got a lot of those comments as far as what they recommend. I'm talking about any established
No,
reputable
that's what I'm
organizations,
saying. I mean,
right?
from like the University of Michigan's Middle East or North Africa.
Okay,
I can have you,
absolutely.
I can have the
Okay,
director
I would
send you
love
the
to hear that.
definition.
You want the
Yeah.
Columbia Middle East definition, you'll get it.
Nicholas went to Michigan. You didn't tell me they had a MENA category.
That was many moons ago.
No, I'm just
Okay.
giving her a hard time.
Now,
Yes, please.
now I want to say something about religious. Before coming here, I ran the data on Israeli-born in the most recent ACS. So you have 20% uncodable entry.
Uncodable,
And the vast majority are Jews.
Right, so you're,
Because I can split, I mean, I can classify them to Jews and Palestinians by language spoken at home and other variables. So among Jews, it's a major issue. I mean, some Jews don't know any other identity but their Jewishness. Now, I understand the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Census. What I'm saying is, if you can keep the uncodable entry, I think it's 999 or 998, keep it only for religion. That will be very helpful for researchers. Okay?
Okay, so what
Don't,
he's-
I mean, because I heard before, I mean, I think you told me that Sephardic is also uncodable. I don't know why it's uncodable.
okay, so
It had
what
nothing to do
so
with
what he's
religion.
talking about,
But I would keep the uncodable only for religion, Shi'i, Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, etc. So if Copt is also ethnic group, keep it. The more group you can keep, the better. Now, another comment. There is no cost in including as many ethnic group over there as possible, right? Armenians. Some people spoke and said that Bedouins are not an ethnicity. Perhaps it's not, but as far as I know, Bedouins come from the Middle East. Are there Bedouin coming from other places than the Middle East? Oh, okay, I didn't know. Where in Asia? Central Asia. And what proportion? I see. Yeah, okay, but I thought the vast majority come from the Middle East, but apparently I'm wrong. So that's
okay, so let me go to your first question. So let me understand what you said. So basically what you did is that he went to the American Community Survey data, probably the PUMS file, right? The data that's publicly available, right?
publicly available.
And you looked at people who were born in Israel.
Right.
And then you crossed it by ancestry.
Right.
Okay. And then what you did was look at the proportion of those Israelis that were born in Israel that had an uncodable code.
Right.
Right, and so what's in that uncodable code? Right, presumably, we give a 998 for those for religious terms.
Right, so you've
Right.
got
And so, but we don't know what those what those codes were. I mean, you're saying that you're making an assumption that they wrote in Jewish, right?
most of them Jewish.
Okay.
A few of them probably
Okay.
Muslims and
Right.
perhaps. a
So
few
what I
Christians.
want to, and you probably, and he may be right, I certainly don't know that, but one of the things I do want to make clear is that we're not tabulating religion, right? We just give it a generic code to a lot, so if someone in the ancestry question says, I'm Catholic, for example, we just give it a generic code. You're not able to know how many people
I
said
completely,
Catholic, for example.
I completely understand. All what I'm
Yeah.
saying is keep it that way
Okay.
and keep it only for religions. So, so
So
that.
you can indirectly.
So that I can
Okay, I got
indirectly
it.
infer.
Because then
No,
you're
I mean,
going, because then you're using other variables in ACS. For example, you're looking at language.
Right.
You're looking at other words
Right.
to
Right.
develop an
Right.
algorithm
I mean,
to come up, okay.
I think I basically, I succeeded in taking the Israeli born and figure out who is Jewish, who is Palestinian, just by the language spoken at home and the ancestry.
That's why we invited you here. We saw a lot of your great work that you've done. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your comments. Okay, so now moving, back sure, back there, Mehdi.
Nicholas, there's an issue that has to be addressed here, and that is that the national resource centers, the Middle East studies, Near East centers, Middle East centers, that are roughly about 19 or so, major universities across the country, like Michigan, like UCLA, Berkeley, Harvard, Chicago, Columbia. By sort of law, they are restricted from looking at the U.S. They are supposed to be, they're international studies centers. Do you see? So when you go to them and ask questions about the census, they might be lip tight about this because that's not their purview. And this has been part of the problem all along dealing with these populations because ethnic studies leave them out because they're not legal minorities. Middle East centers leave them out because they cannot deal with the US population, so they fall in between cracks. And I think that's why you have, but if you ask virtually every center, they'll say, of course, Turkey, Armenians, all of these is under their, Israeli is sort of a much more of a touchy issue, but increasingly that's also included. So I think that is something that to be considered. To be considered, a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're moving this way. Okay, Louise?
I'm one of these people that reads the technical appendices for every census since 1890, I think I did, and I noticed how Arabs have been recoded. If they say non-white, they're recoded as white if they're identified as an Arab by language, or Palestinians who wrote Jerusalem were recoded as Israeli, and anyhow, there's 100 years of history. How are you going to recode the loads of people that are going to answer Muslim? That's my first question, because it's going to happen.
Okay. So you mean
And they're going to, they're going to get recoded, right?
No, I mean, well, hold on. Let me. Do you have, how many questions do you
The
have?
second one is simpler, but it's about sampling, but it's not you'll be able to answer it. You don't need your sample.
So, okay, so the first, if they only, and I'm gonna have everybody help me out
If
here.
that's the
So if the
only
only
response
thing
to
they
that thing.
respond, is just say Muslim,
Yeah.
only. Then
MENA,
If they check
Muslim.
MENA Muslim,
but that's different.
they're gonna be MENA. If they check
But-
MENA and
but-
write in Muslim,
Are they going to
then,
be called other or unclassified?
No,
No.
just MENA.
Just
So
MENA.
that's why we wanted to clarify what your scenario was.
right,
If someone checks a box, we don't erase that box.
No, I
But if they
understand.
give us something that's uncodable, like human being,
right.
we don't code that.
And they do.
But that other response that's valid stays.
Right, I understand, but when you go to like the PUMS data, you do get this minute detail of what other things people in that category said they were, and you might get Syrian, Assyrian, Lebanese, but you might have this big empty category, which he was just referring to.
Right.
This big empty category.
Well, so you have to understand, before you get the data publicly available from the census or from the ACS, remember, and we don't have time to go through all of this, we do a lot of data processing, a lot of data editing, if you will, to prepare the data for confidentiality purposes, right? And also just, like he said, if someone says, I'm from Mars, well, we don't have a code for that. Usually we just blanket. And now, in the case of, to go back to your question, because I don't want to avoid it, right? So if someone only writes in Muslim only, we're not coding that. Now, if they said I'm Syrian Muslim, then we'll code the Syrian part.
Because
Okay.
they wouldn't do that at all.
Or the, Assyrian or whatever, whatever they have there, or
It's kind of a
Lebanese. So we'll
global
code
Muslim
the
identity.
specific nationality or ethnic group. So if
So
they
it's-
check a box, we'll keep the box.
So if people are encouraged to say Muslim, we lose the data.
If-
Okay. My
we
second
don't code it.
question, right, okay, this is about oversampling, you talked about. But if the Sudanese and the Somalis are not included in your MENA category, how would you oversample them? Like, is that gonna become a problem? If in the group, in the definition of MENA you have now, Somalis and Sudanese, for example, are not part of that definition. So it hasn't expanded yet, we're at that point, so you're gonna oversample.
Right.
You're not gonna that says to me that technically you're not gonna oversample Sudanese and Somalis, which means we're gonna get the same result we had before the MENA category. You're gonna produce
Right,
the
so they may be in
outcome.
another oversample. Remember, we talked about how we have strata? So the
Yeah.
strata is inclusive of different groups where everyone has an opportunity to come into the sample,
Right.
regardless of what you are. But we have oversamples for the black population, for the Asian population, for the MENA population.
Hispanic
So-
population.
And then for the general population that's not part of those specific oversampling strata. So all households have a chance to be in the survey. It's just that we're trying to get more households of different specific key population groups into the sample. And again, as Roberto said, we can have the technical experts as they're developing this sampling framework prepare to talk about more of that information, but that work
Or
is under
send you that
development.
information to you.
Yeah, I just want them to be alert to this
Right.
categorical problem.
Right.
Maya?
In terms of the countries included in MENA,
Let's go back to that.
yeah. So I guess I would love to hear sort of next steps for fixing, as you know, what I think has been a mistake. I think Samar articulated it sort of perfectly, that there is an existing definition of what is the Arab countries part of the Arab League, and then we've got the +3 scenario. And then the separate conversation that you have about including the other ethnicities. So on the first one, what's the next step to getting to the point of at least understanding that? Because while I appreciate other academic institutions can offer some of that, I also appreciate the comment made at the other table that that's in some ways uncharted waters for some of these institutions. So how do we get to the point of accepting what we all kind of walked through the door, pretty much
Right.
understanding what is MENA?
Well, it
I think
starts out
Sahar
with
made the
this-
same point earlier.
So yes, to answer your first question, this starts with this form right now. So it's the feedback that you get. So when I get those forms in, that'll be in the results of everyone in here will help feed recommendations into that classification. So that's one.
So there's agreement that we're talking Arab League +3. Is there anyone in the room that would care to, I understand the Arab League sucks for some, I heard that. But, and I'm not being glib about it, that yes, Arab League isn't everything it wants to be. So is there Arab League +3?
Well, I think probably best that you fill out the
Individual
forms and give
forms.
it back. I don't
Okay.
want to put
So we're
anybody on the
really
spot here,
relying on
but.
everybody to
but
provide
that's-
their
that's-
individual forms, so
yeah.
you don't continue that piece of it. Okay.
Right. And so, and back to your question, Maya, too, is that, and recall too that well, this is the thing we're going to do. We also have an additional 9 experts that we identified that are going to be giving us feedback. And guess what? There's going to be more. Because we're gonna ask you, and now I'm stealing my talking points at the end, but I'll do it now, is that we want to continue this conversation with you. So we want you to tell us, hey, Roberto, Nicholas, Meraris, there's a couple of other experts you need to talk to as well. And then we want to send them the binder and send them and get the feedback from them. So this is going to be a continuous process, so this is the process we plan to do.
So just to clarify on that, in terms of the timeline, to address Louise's point, will this part of the clarification take place before your testing?
For this fall test? No, not for, right now, we have the.
How did we
well,
answer Louise's question then?
So the thing of it is, for the classification part, when we get the results in from this test, we're gonna look at different, version A, version B, version C of different, that you can classify easily because the data is there. So whether you include, so people wrote in Turkish, for example, right? What does it look like when you include them in or not, as far as that is concerned? But the questions right now, the Middle Eastern, North African category, that's what we're testing itself, and the examples that we have listed right now.
So in thinking about oversampling, we'll include Sudanese, we'll include Turks, we'll include
They will be
Somalis.
included in the other populations.
Just to
group.
clarify, the oversample is not detail group specific.
Right.
We're not doing an oversample for
General.
Sudanese, an oversample for Lebanese, an oversample for Turkish, Japanese, Chinese, et
oversampling
cetera. MENA,
But if you
and
start with
also
your
black,
definition of MENA that
and also,
excludes Turks and Sudanese,
right, but they may fall into another group's oversample. So there's an oversample for Asian, there's an oversample for Pacific Islander, et cetera.
but it's not tracking our data, it's not tracking MENA.
Well, we never have. We never oversample for MENA, period, at all, until
Right,
to this test coming up.
We're
So,
getting slightly circular. I understand it, but I'm saying if you capture Sudanese in another part of your oversample because they're fit black, that's great, but that doesn't capture, right, in terms of these questions, or does it? I'm
Well,
trying
it
to
does,
understand,
because
like-
if the idea is to say, hey, you're Sudanese, right? You get an experimental form, how is it that you respond to another Sudanese who got a different experimental form? That's the idea behind it. So it's, it's clear to me that we're going to have to follow up with you on some of the technical aspects in here. We just felt that today we were going to spend all day on the classification part. These are very good technical questions. Unfortunately, we just don't have the experts here to tell us about those specific aspects. And I don't want to go more into speculating how it's going to be sampled, oversampled. We just don't have those experts here. But we'll follow up with you on that.
So I do want to make a note. So regarding the oversampling, like Nicholas mentioned, so we are oversampling for the overall groups, right? Black, Asian, Hispanic, and MENA. In the case of the Somali and Sudanese, although right now they're not in the working classification, they're still going to get a form. So if they go ahead and fill out the form and say, I'm Middle Eastern or North African, that's where I'm going to get the data from. So it doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily move them into black. Even if they fall into the definition of the black category, when I tabulate the data, I say, you know what, we have them under black, but when I look at the data, I know that they're identifying as Middle Eastern and North African. So along with your feedback and the data that we're gonna be getting from the NCT, it's how we then can move forward and say, you know what, we're seeing that these groups identify within that. So regardless of where we have them in the classification, it's all about self-ID. If they do not identify as MENA, then it's beyond us, really. It's about the population self-identifying with that category. So then we can say, we have your feedback, we saw the data, and this is what we should recommend.
Can I make one final point, Margaret, please?
Sure, absolutely.
Sorry, I did just want to point out that, yes, with the self-identification, I understand that. But when you put a form in front of them, where I've noticed one in all of your sample forms, you include Somali in the Black or African American category, that's going to skew your results as to whether they should be in.
And that's a great point. But then again, we have the second component where we do the re-interview, which we did in the 2010. And then we go back and we're going to ask, okay, so you said you were this. And this is where we get a lot of the people saying, well, I did Somali because I was in the black category, but really I'm Middle Eastern and North African. Right. So we will have that additional data. So it all feeds into that. And I will say that we have seen cognitive tests. We do cognitive testing before all this national content test or ACS test that we're doing. And we are seeing how respondents would still see sometimes examples in certain lines and say, that's not where I go here. And they would still check that. So we have data from cognitive testing that also supports this, but we have to do the national content test as it is. And then of course, then we have that re-interview component that will give us even more data.
But
Well, that's
Those are the
feedback
things we're
that you're
trying
providing
to
us right
learn.
now.
So we want to bring it back to how this is all rooted in the definitions that are out there.
Right.
For OMB, which defines all of the groups in terms of they're part of this region, we don't take Filipino, which is listed specifically as an example for Asian, and say, well, it really belongs as Pacific Islander because it's an island in the Pacific. That's currently how it's defined. We may find that Filipinos are writing in something else. That's what we're trying to learn through the test. Even if the examples are there, and that's currently the way the definition places it, we're expecting to find complexities, and we want to drill down to find out more about why that's happening. So you have to have a starting point.
can we just take this away a bit
And that's
from?
part of the feedback we want. So,
Yeah.
you're not happy with the Somali example, right? Well, that's what we want to hear.
What do you do about the cases where it's the white category, when it bleeds into the white category? Because most of the examples given talk about the non-white category. Basically, you can capture, as you say, if it bleeds into the other non-white categories. But what if you're asking Iranians or Israelis or Turks, and they say white? Since you're not oversampling the white population, or then that would provide a problem, won't it? If you think about it.
Like I said, we're going to be talking to our technical experts.
Well, you see,
and
this
so we
is-
don't want to, yes,
If
go
you
ahead.
say, the problem is when you say Turkish, right? I mean, if Turks identify, where is Turkey usually? It's in the Middle East Studies centers, yes, but it is also in the European centers. I mean, so Turks can be at either place,
Right.
usually. So if that's the case, where do we belong if you think about it? So what if half of the Turks say that they're from the Middle East, you capture those Turks? What about the other half says that they're Europeans or they're whites?
We can't
What-
speculate, we don't know. We don't know how they're gonna report. That's part of the test, right? Remember that that's why we have all these different experimental forms to look exactly how these populations will report. And so one of the limitations we have is that we don't know. We have not tested this category before in in these forms, so we can't speculate how the population will report or not.
Exactly.
One things we are testing, as I mentioned, is that we're testing new instructions, we're testing new terms, new categories. And so, by the way, it's not just how the MENA population reports. Many other groups, for example, that we're examining is the Latinos, that we're wondering how they're going to respond to a combined style question. We're also looking at the white population. We have examples for the white population that we've never had before. How are they going to respond?
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, let's go back to the black population. Now we have examples underneath there. Unfortunately, we don't, I wish I could show you all the other designs. Let's go back to MENA, because this is why we're here, right? Let's talk about this, okay? So what you're seeing here is just a small snapshot of what we have available for the testing strategies that we have for this fall. So, no, the web design. So, for example, this is just one example of a web design for the Middle Eastern North African population. But guess what? We have one for white, just like this. We have one for black. We have this for Asian. And so those are things that you're not seeing. So, for example, go to the previous slide, please. So if someone checks white or black, they're going to get these subsequent screens where they can check a box and write it in. Okay, so, and another thing too I want to mention that I think, hopefully I won't steal the director's talking points, is that, we're really moving away from paper for 2020, folks. Not that paper is not going to be around, it's going to be around, but we're really emphasizing electronics now, web, and as Nicholas mentioned earlier, the iPad and maybe even the Google phone. So we're looking at, web designs, for example. We believe that a larger proportion of the population will using the web. In fact, right now, ACS, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, half the folks enumerated or contacted by the ACS are coming in through the web design, if I'm not, so.
Some people are more, so it's not just internet-based in the sense of a computer. It's web-enabled, meaning some groups may have smartphones that's their only access to the net.
Right.
But that's how they can fill out the form.
Right. Okay, so in the interest of time, I know there's, this is good debate, good lively debate. I just want to make sure I get to all the, other, so let me get to Gigi, and then we'll keep going. So I'll get back to you.
I just want to say again, we really appreciate this forum and a way to give feedback. One of my concerns, maybe as a research methodologist, is there someone on the inside at the census that understands the Middle Eastern North African community enough to help with sampling and these type of issues? I guess what my question is, are you getting feedback on these test forms from people that are trained in methods, stats, sampling, these areas, other than this forum? I mean,
Here at the Bureau, you mean?
Yes, I mean, I guess I'm asking, do you have both the methodology and the content experts here? I mean, you do, you're the census, you're amazing.
You're at the United
Absolutely.
States Census Bureau. We are the premier, and Middle East experts. Okay, well, that's why many of you are here. Well, besides ourselves, we have some others, but we don't have experts, for example, like a sampled expert that's on Middle East or black or anything like that. These are all highly trained statisticians and mathematicians that come here. And, remember, we've been collecting race and ethnicity data for a very long time. So we've been targeting these populations for decades.
Right.
So.
No, and I understand that, and I'm not saying that, you all are amazing, and I mean that when I say that, and it's a hard job. What I'm asking is, when you're going and you're sort of figuring out, and you're testing all these different forms and the kind of permutations, are there times along that process in which
individuals are giving feedback
Right.
on specific MENA
Yes.
group that, okay, that's.
Yes,
sort of the
absolutely.
question.
Thank
Okay.
you. I misunderstood. Yes, absolutely. In fact, population division, the division that is represented here, is working very closely with these other divisions that are doing the sample experts and the mathematicians. So we work in hand very well. In fact, we have several of our colleagues here that are from other divisions that we work closely. So we have a lot of intra-agency working groups that come together. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So.
But just another thing, Dan, do you need some feedback on the actual Dil Yardım Kılavuzu Turkish? Because the translation here
Oh,
is,
man.
there's a lot of problems in it.
We'll talk to you after
Okay, cool.
after the forum. So really bad already, huh? Okay.
No,
Well, that's
just
that we need
to
feedback.
make a note about that,
Yeah.
that is part of the research that's happening for the future, where as we're trying to determine the content, in the future for other research, there's a language working group, for example, that the National Advisory Committee is forming. They will be talking about the translation of all these materials and outreach materials into multiple different languages. So the first part is to set the content. The work after that is then to figure out how to enable that content to reach all communities.
Okay, so Rita, yes.
I just wanted to bring this together, what Maya was saying and what Luis, along with your response. In the spirit of being more inclusive, I think the idea of Arab League plus 3, plus all the ethnicities was proposed. But in a sense, it was to include all the countries and the sub-national ethnicities that you have on this list. And I want to explain to the group that it's not that the Census Bureau is resisting including these nationalities. They just don't have a framework to include them. For instance, other than saying that Somalia and Sudan are within the Arab League, there's no other classification out there that includes Somalia and Sudan. And I believe that's why we are here as this forum, to provide you with this expertise, although you will never find the institutional support for this, because they are different kinds of programs, and we really cannot create a category based on development programs or trade. So in the spirit of being inclusive, Rachel, if we can go to the list of countries that are already in your working definition, plus those that have been suggested, the next slide, no, the other, yeah, this one. Is there resistance in the room to including these countries in the working definition and asking the Census Bureau to test them? Would that give you the framework to say the panel of experts that we invited
That would be
highly
that would be a
recommended,
start. That would be a
100%?
start.
And I think that's why you keep asking for the forms, because if you have form, then you have data that you can then show Congress or OMB and say, based on all the experts that were in the room, they all gave us this form, said you must include all the above, no exclusion. Am I understanding you right?
That would be very helpful.
And
Let's
so
just say
that would help you, help
yes.
us.
Absolutely.
Sounds like
That's
Jerry
a great
Maguire
start,
here.
right.
But would that
Yeah.
would
Yes.
that answer your question, Maya?
That's precisely why we're here. Exactly
Would
right.
that-
We need the feedback. We need the forms. This is why it's very critical before you leave today to make sure you give us your forms today so we can collect that feedback. So yes, to answer your question, that'll be part of one of many steps into the recommendations we make, the expert forum results, the national content test results, and et cetera. So yes, that is part of the stakeholder engagement that we plan to do.
Will you still need the institutional backing, or is this enough?
Well, we're going to continue doing research and contacting other institutions.
But
and
knowing
stuff.
that you're not going to have any organization on the face of the earth that's going to include all these.
Well,
Right?
that would be part of the research, and we find out that there's no such thing, which we've been finding. You're right. So that'd be part of that decision process. No, that's what we're planning to do for the content. Right, for the national content test, this 15 is not including these right now. Right, okay. I think it's time for a break. What do y'all think? We're almost there. Let's see, you have one more question, and then we're gonna take a 10-minute break.
It's not a question, just clarification. She keeps talking about Arab League, and we all know that all those countries are in the Arab League since the war that happened in the 60s and 50s. So why are we including all those in Arab League? She keeps saying Arab Leagues +3. We shouldn't include any of these countries in the Arab League because it's political, and race and ethnicity is different from what's happening in the Arab League, and we all know that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. That's why we need that feedback, you know, and so please make sure that you write that in your feedback form, okay? Okay, so one last, all right, why don't you talk me into it? One last one, and then we're gonna take a 10-minute break.
Sorry, just quick. I just had a question. Why is Copt being treated as an ethnic group? It's a religion, and I'm Egyptian, and one of the conversations I've had with fellow Egyptians who are, I'm not Coptic, is they're actually very particular. This is in the Egyptian context, not necessarily in the American context, and if someone can enlighten me, I'd appreciate it, is they're actually particular in saying we are not a minority, we're Egyptian, just like any other Egyptian, we're just of a different religion, and then there's obviously a history. But I can just say that from my experiences, we don't consider Copts as a different ethnicity. Actually, that's one of the things that has kept, in my opinion,
Right.
Egypt together. So I would be interested in knowing if that is something that the Coptic community self-identifies as being a different ethnic group as opposed to a different religion. The second is, I don't understand why we are including Somalia or Djibouti or Mauritania or Chad. To me, they're not North African. They're anything that's sub-Saharan African is Africa. This isn't based on culture. It's not based on language. Nobody looks at Somalia or Eritrea or Ethiopia or Kenya that had huge Muslim populations, and some of which may speak Arabic in addition to other languages. And even, I don't know how Sudan, because it's, anyway, Sudan's might also qualify. I realize these are controversial statements, but it just isn't consistent.
Right.
I mean, I look at North Africa and I see, there's the line, and it pretty much, the Western Sahara, Algeria, I mean, it's very clear. And it's not that those other groups won't be tracked, they absolutely will be. And they
Right.
can put African Sudanese, African Somalian. But I'm just not seeing the consistency in that inclusion
Okay.
of that.
So what I'm seeing, this will be the last question before we break. So what I'm seeing is exactly what we wanted. This is some great feedback that you're giving us. We came up with a working classification. We told you the rationale, how we came up to it, and now we're getting some good reaction about who to include and not include. And that's the kind of feedback we want. Now, I don't know if there's anyone in here that can talk about the Copt
I can.
expertise.
I
And
am a
so-
Copt who's non-religious.
Okay.
And know lots of Copts. And they distinguish themselves from the Muslim Egyptians, but Coptic as descendants of ancient Egyptians as an ethnic group that has a language that is partially used. So it's a little bit different. I think it would be similar to other, to Chaldeans and other groups. So we can talk about it after.
Just to add to that, I did some research on this when I was here, and this is the pre-Arab civilization that existed in Egypt, even before Christianity, and having the language, even the Coptic language, and most importantly, there are people who do report that in the response.
Okay, so we have now, if you can please come back in exactly 10 minutes at 2:45, and we'll resume with our session D. Thank you so much.